New Brunswick has several strengths, and we often don't hear about them. One of them is aquaculture. And while we had a bit of a boom back in the 80s and the 90s on doing aquaculture and salmon farming, at the same time, there was an awful lot of scientific research going on making sure that it's a safe food product, that the environment is safe, and that our community has got a balance between how we farm, just like we farmed on the land, and how we farm at sea. Today's guest is going to bring us incredible scientific depth and insight as to the work that's been going on for almost 30 years, but that we know today is genetically modified salmon. Our guest today is Tillman Benfey. He's a professor of biology at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, and his specialty is in the area of aquaculture. And there's another piece that I'm forgetting.
Fish physiology.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here. Aquaculture, big piece of New Brunswick's identity
Yeah.
and big piece of its economy. Is it also a big piece of its science world?
Yeah. Salmon farming Canadian salmon farming began in St. Andrews in New Brunswick, so we have a long history of developing salmon as an aquaculture species, and it's very much a science-based industry. Scientists in the federal government and universities.
So we'll get to explore maybe a touch later that balance between food and science and general public's comfort zone with understanding that, and maybe how media portrays it. But when we were warming up, you started talking about a project that you're working on down at the Huntsman Marine Institute in St. Andrews. Can you fill us in a bit about that?
Yeah, we're looking at one of the pesticides that is used by the salmon farming industry to treat sea lice. So trying to ensure that the treatment protocols that are used are safe in terms of environmental impacts, and specifically we're looking at lobster responses to sea lice pesticides.
So how long would a study like that go on for? Months, years?
Yeah, it's budgeted as a 2-year project. Involves a graduate student from University of New Brunswick doing all the research at Huntsman.
Yeah.
So probably about a year's worth of research, and then the student has coursework to do and a thesis to write as well.
Cool. And do you get all the credit for that after the grad?
I get some of the credit. Yeah. As, typically the students do most of the work, and they should get most of the glory.
Sure. And is it a new area? Given that now we've had 25 to 30 years of aquaculture in the Bay of Fundy.
Yeah.
The old logic was back then the flushing mechanism of the bay is enough to make sure the other ecosystems stay in balance. Science is starting to show us no, that isn't quite the case.
Yeah, well, sea lice are a naturally occurring parasite on wild salmon, so they've always been in the Bay of Fundy. As long as we've had salmon, we've had sea lice.
Mm-hmm.
How much of a concern it is varies from one year to the next. Some years it's a major issue for farmed salmon, other years it isn't.
Mm.
It's something that'll never go away because they exist on wild fish.
Mm.
So it's something that you always need to address, and it's a moving target. As you come up with one treatment option, the sea lice adapt, and you need to come up with something else. Mm. So it's sort of a part of an integrated pest management strategy, just like we would use for potato farming or terrestrial agriculture.
Would that also tie to density, like population density in the cages and also the number of cages in a specific area?
Yeah, as I said, the sea lice come from the wild population of fish. Yeah. But of course there's far more salmon in cages to carry sea lice. So that's one of the concerns, is that salmon farms act as an amplification site for sea lice production. Mm. So farmed fish become infected from wild fish, and then sea lice mature on the farmed salmon, and those could potentially reinfect wild salmon. Mm. And the more salmon you have, the more opportunity there is for sea lice to become a problem. And that's why you need to keep coming up with strategies for managing sea lice.
Humans have a habit of thinking they can control nature, and what you just said sort of sparked for me, like nature's going to do what nature's going to do, and you have to find what the rhythm or the balance is. Yeah.
Well, sea lice are a parasite of salmon, naturally occurring, so they've co-evolved together. Yeah. So it's hard to break a cycle that has evolved over millions of years, right? Sea lice know how to survive on salmon. Yeah. And in fact, salmon survive just fine with sea lice. Otherwise, that relationship, that parasite-host relationship, wouldn't last. Yep. So as long as sea lice numbers are low, everything's fine. It's when there's an outbreak of high numbers of sea lice that becomes a problem.
Which then gets into what your research is after with a graduate student about the impact on other systems and other species.
Yeah. So there's a number of strategies. There's not one way to deal with sea lice. You need to have multiple strategies to use at the same time. And some are better, some are worse, some are more effective at dealing with sea lice. Some of them can have knockoff effects on wild organisms. There's a number of treatment strategies that include chemical treatment for sea lice, and none of them are specific to sea lice. So the concern is what other organisms might be affected by them. So the one we're working with specifically will affect not just sea lice, but sea lice are crustaceans like lobsters and crabs. They'll also affect lobsters and crabs.
Yep.
So when you're using the pesticide as per the protocol under a veterinarian's guidance, which is the way you have to do it, then it should have minimal impact on wild lobsters and other animals. But minimal impact doesn't mean no impact. So it's a balance of ensuring that your salmon farming operation is viable without having too much of an impact on wild populations.
Does some of the work you're doing now have a connection back to when Cook Aquaculture was fined for the impact on the lobster fishery in that area, on the use of a pesticide? Are they the same thing? Because that was a fairly big news story.
Yeah, absolutely.
In its day.
There's very much a connection, not to the pesticide that we're testing. So the pesticide that we are testing is an approved pesticide for sea lice treatment. So it is being used in the aquaculture industry. It's used with the permission of the government. Okay. You need a veterinarian prescription to use it, so that's the way it works. The seed money that we got to do this research actually came directly from the fine that was paid for the use of a different compound.
Ah, all right. Because that was a major story once upon a time, and pretty significant too, both economically and in a way spiritually for a community, because one industry was deeply impacting another industry, and it was proven to be connected.
And that was our thought, was to try to address the reason why this fine was put in place, to try to address that with some good research to come up with the appropriate ways to use sea lice pesticides.
So you're doing all that good research at a time when the previous federal government was taking a totally different direction on the value of scientific research, and 600,000 pieces of, according to mainstream media, research being buried somewhere or discarded.
Well, as you probably know, we had some of the world experts doing sea lice pesticide toxicity work in St. Andrews at the St. Andrews Biological Station. Yep. And that program was cut. The federal science program was cut.
And when you say cut, does that mean it just stops the next day? Like there's no grandfathering, there's no gradual transition, it's done now?
Yeah, no, so I'm optimistic that things are going to change, but you're right, this is no longer relevant research from the perspective of the government of the day.
So somewhere 10 years from now, there'll be an asterisk in the books to say our research took us from here to here, from 82, 84 to 2014, and boink, and then there's a 3-year gap.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's true to some extent, but some of that research carried on, just not by federal government scientists, unfortunately, who were a lot of the experts in the field. Okay.
Does private sector ever help fund that sort of work?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So this specific project that I'm doing now, not in this case, it's funded by federal and provincial government. But in my own case and in other cases, there's a lot of opportunities to collaborate with the aquaculture industry or with any industry to co-sponsor research projects. I've had a number of projects like that.
So in a way, you kind of represent that bridge between when speaking about the university at New Brunswick and Fredericton, and it's a teaching institution, but it's also a research institution. And you've just defined it's also world-class in certain areas. We don't often hear those stories that we're really quite good in some areas. I know there's the River Institute. They do exceptional work. There's stuff around forestry that's quite exceptional. There's now the new burgeoning IT incubator kind of mindset going on. But fishing ties to food.
Yeah, and that's really what drew me to New Brunswick. You know, I'm not from New Brunswick. I've always been interested in doing aquaculture research, so doing high quality research is sort of fundamental to the university process, and that may or may not have direct applicability, obvious applicability. So in my case, I've always wanted to do more applied research, and specifically in support of aquaculture. And New Brunswick was the obvious place to go. Really, New Brunswick or British Columbia are the options in Canada to do that.
How long ago was that you moved here?
1989, so 27 years ago.
Right in the thick of when the McKenna government was starting to issue the licenses.
And 1989, aquaculture was a very new industry in New Brunswick, so it's a much more mature industry now than it was then.
Yeah. Where do we fit worldwide? I remember some of the Scandinavian countries were getting into aquaculture, if I've got the right part of.
Yeah, so if you look at salmon aquaculture specifically, Canada's number 4.
Okay.
Scotland and, well, Norway is by far number 1. Scotland and Chile are the other 2 big producers. Canada comes in number 4. British Columbia is the biggest producer of farm salmon in Canada. Historically, New Brunswick was the 2nd largest, but is now in fact the 3rd largest after Newfoundland. Newfoundland has a very rapidly growing salmon farming industry.
Okay.
But that's salmon farming, so Canada is relatively important in that sense.
Yeah.
If you look at global aquaculture production, it's meaningless. It pales, in comparison to what's being done in China, for instance. But not salmon. They're not farming salmon. They're farming other species in China.
The notion of farming seafood or farming out of the ocean, even that is a fairly new idea, isn't it?
Well, again, it depends on your context. So in Canada, yes, we have a maybe 100-year maximum history of any kind of aquaculture.
Yeah. And
initially, that was more for enhancing wild stocks.
Okay.
So sort of commercial aquaculture, salmon farming, something like that, that has maybe a 30-year history in Canada. But people have been farming aquatic foods for thousands of years, not in Canada, but again in China. China, there are textbooks on how to farm aquatic organisms that are 2,000 or 3,000 years old.
Wow.
From China.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because the lay notion of farming and fishing, for example, the farmer has the intimate relationship with the land, and there's a cyclical pattern and seasonal pattern. Yeah. And the fisherman, by contrast, goes out, captures what's available, and brings it back, and there's no completion of the cycle or the circle. And
we've done that. We've known how to do that for a long time. And in the more traditional farm species like pigs and cows and chickens, we don't go out and hunt wild pigs and chickens. You wouldn't even know where to find an animal like that. We've been farming them for thousands of years.
Yes.
And that's a transition from hunting wild animals to farming them. So that's a transition we made thousands of years ago for terrestrial animals. Yeah. We are literally right in the middle of that transition right now. Wow. Right now, roughly half of aquatic seafoods are captured from the wild, and roughly half are farmed.
Really?
And wild captures, the yield from wild captures haven't increased in about 30 years, and aquaculture is increasing exponentially.
If we were to use media as our only narrative about where we get our food from, the impression is declining seafood stocks. Yeah. But we don't get the counterbalance about the increase in our ability to farm seafood.
And it's an imperative, maybe not necessarily salmon, which is sort of a high-end product, but just in terms of feeding a growing global population. Seafood it's a very healthy source of food, and we literally cannot extract any more from the oceans. We've maxed out. In fact, as you know, with cod, we've gone beyond the maximum.
Yeah. The impact of freezer trawlers and technology and the ability to fish deeper and deeper waters, not to mention the changes in the ocean's temperature. And we can't know. Humans have this habit of wanting to know something. Like they go in a store and need to touch every dress or every shirt on the thing before they pick which one they want. We need to seem to have this physical inventory, and if we can't see it, then we can't seem to manage it well.
And again, cod is a classic example where we had some of the largest captures ever just a year or two before the fishery collapsed, because we didn't really have a good handle on what was out there.
Yeah, and that form of science that needs to know so then you can manage, which makes sense. It's rational, logical, but intuitively, somewhere someone must have been thinking, we can't keep going this way because it can't replenish itself fast enough. Bay of Fundy, why there? It has to do with temperature and the flushing mechanism? Why not Bay of Chaleur and some other places?
Yeah, it depends on the species you want to farm, and salmon has always been the backbone of our aquaculture industry, at least our fish aquaculture industry. So we can talk a bit about things like oysters and mussels as well, but for fish, it's always been salmon. And the reason for that is we have a long history of fishing for salmon. It's a species, it's an important food fishery, it's important for First Nations. It's a species we really understand.
Yeah, okay.
And as a result, we have a long history of understanding the biology of salmon. So it was a easy transition to go from learning the biology of wild salmon to rearing them in captivity and farming salmon. But that said, the problem is salmon really is not well suited for confining in cages in the ocean, because, at least on the east coast of Canada, because of seawater temperatures in the wintertime. So seawater temperatures go below their threshold in the winter time for almost the entire coastline of Atlantic Canada. There's just a few areas where they can survive, and the Bay of Fundy is one of those. So, and even not the entire Bay of Fundy, just part of the Bay of Fundy. Sort of the outer Passamaquoddy Bay, Grand Manan, Campobello, that area.
Tucked right in there.
You go further up the bay, they can't survive there. Most of the shoreline of Nova Scotia, they can't survive. Most of the shoreline of Newfoundland, they can't survive. There's just a few pockets. And some areas like Prince Edward Island and Baie des Chaleurs, not only does it get too cold in the winter, but ironically it gets too hot in the summer.
Really?
Yeah, it goes above their limits. So the temperature profile of the Bay of Fundy in the summer actually is just perfect for salmon. In the winter it's pretty cold. They don't grow very fast, if at all, but certainly they can survive.
Okay. What about the mobility thing? I mean, we all see the pictures of wild salmon and being able to cover long distances and the homing instinct to come back to certain spots. And the other version is inside of a circle that's 100 feet in diameter. And is there something to the spirit or the soul of the fish needing to swim great distances to be its authentic self, if that makes sense?
So to the spirit, to the soul, I don't know, but to the biology, yes. And, but that's, again, that's a part of farming, is you really don't want to be farming animals that are wild animals, because they're not adapted to living in that farm environment. They're adapted to living in the wild. Yeah. So generation by generation by generation, through domestication, you turn that wild animal that wants to swim to Greenland or whatever, and is actually designed for that, through selecting every generation through a breeding program, something that in fact is optimally adapted for living in that environment. And that's exactly what we've done with cows and pigs and chickens, and that's exactly what we've done, for instance, with dogs. You know, we've domesticated them from wolves. They're different animals. They're animals that do well in captivity. Yeah.
Humans got to figure out how to do well in captivity. Are you giving us and the audience a version of what you do in the classroom?
Yeah, I think so. Aquaculture is a very broad topic. It involves economics, it involves sociology, it involves engineering. So biology is one component of that, and the aquaculture courses that I teach in aquaculture research, I do focuses on the biological aspect. So I teach a fourth-year course in aquaculture, sort of a capstone course where students try to use the knowledge from first and second and third year to apply it to something. So in this case, they get to see how what they've learned in biochemistry, basic genetics, and so on, to something that actually has value. So how do we take that biological knowledge and turn it into a successful way of farming, in this case, fish.
With the next generation, I'm curious, is there a sense of a breakthrough coming? What the next big thing is? The IT world will forever work that way, and it's a different set of circumstances, because you got a controlled environment, and you're trying to figure out what the next app is that does something good or makes you money or whatever, however you define your good. But we don't hear much from your industry about what the next big thing might be, is it?
I wouldn't say there is one very big thing. There are a number of, I would say, big things. One of them, so historically and even to this day, we rely a lot on animal, specifically fish protein and fish oil, to manufacture the pellets that we feed to salmon. Salmon are carnivores, so they have a high protein, high energy requirement in their feeds. And how do we do that? Well, we capture other species of fish. So we have a fishery for wild animals, for wild fish, catch other species of fish, and we extract oil from them, fish oil, and we extract protein from them to turn into a powder that's fish meal. And that then goes into feed production. So it goes into chicken feeds, it goes into salmon feed, and so on. Well, ecologically, that doesn't make a lot of sense to go catch fish, to turn them into pellets to feed the fish.
Yep.
So one of those areas that's being pursued in a big way in Canada and elsewhere is to get more and more of that protein meal and that oil from plants rather than from animals. But it's a bit of a challenge because these animals are carnivores. So you're trying to turn your cat, into a plant-eating animal. That's not easy to do. To make sure they're getting the right fats in their diet and the right proteins and amino acids in their diet. So that's a big area of research, is to reduce the reliance on fish protein and fish oil and get more of a plant-based diet. So that's one area. Disease management is another area. Any animal, including ourselves, are always exposed to viruses and bacteria and so on.
And they change a lot too. They're never the same.
And they evolve much more rapidly than the host does. The flu virus that you get evolves much more rapidly than our immune system's ability to fight that. It's the same for farmed fish. So coming up with novel ways of treating diseases is important. Genetics is important. So traditional breeding programs will always be there, by which I mean you select individuals to reproduce to produce the next generation, as we've always done with farmed animals. Another area that's very timely in a Canadian context is genetically modified salmon. So just this year, 2016, the Canadian government has approved the production of genetically modified salmon for food production in Canada. Nobody's actually doing it for sale at this point in time, but it's now legal. That's a new thing. It was approved last year.
It wasn't that long ago.
Last year, yeah. Anyway, it was very recently approved by the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S., and now the Canadian government has followed that as well.
How long a process would that have been to get it to the approval final stage?
It was, I couldn't give you so from the original research to approval was, I can tell you, about 30 years. From application to the FDA to approval, I couldn't tell exactly, but it was at least 10 years. It was a very long process. And there was a parallel process in Canada, but I think the Canadian government wanted to wait and see what the U.S. Food and Drug Administration did first.
Right. That gets into a whole other conversation about public trust, understanding the buzzwords, the genetically modified organism, what media tend to do when they get hold of those phrases. Want to wander into that for a little bit? Because it's your conversation is specific in a certain range, but there's 1,000 other branches we could be going off of it, because it's food security, food supply. There's an economics element to it. There's a health and safety element to it. And somewhere out there, the general public needs to have a finer filter or a greater awareness of what to trust, what not to trust, and learn how to discern the difference between the two. And recognize when their media isn't necessarily telling them something that's going to help them with that process.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think most of us, the general public, don't understand enough of where our food comes from. And that certainly applies to salmon, but I think it applies to any of the foods that we consume, whether it's plants that are farmed or animals that are farmed, and whether those animals are farmed on land or in the sea. Most of us don't know where that package of milk, what actually went into producing that package of milk or that carton of eggs or that salmon fillet or something like that. So in a broader context, it's important that we always educate ourselves. And I think that applies to this whole controversy about genetically modified salmon as well. What does it mean to turn a wild salmon into a farmed salmon? In other words, a domesticated animal. Traditionally, we do that by always selecting individuals that have some characteristics that we think are beneficial. They grow faster, or they're late maturing, or they're disease tolerant or something like that. And we breed those individuals and not the other ones that are slow growers or something like that. And then generation by generation by generation, we gradually make improvements in that animal from the standpoint of what we want in a farmed animal. So we're turning a wild animal into a farmed animal. We're trying to change it from surviving in a wild, or thriving in a wild natural setting, to thriving in a captivity. So the process of making genetically modified salmon, at least in the way most people understand that, taking genes from one species and putting them into another, into salmon. I personally don't have an issue with that as a process. To my mind, it's an accelerated way of genetically improving the fish by different means than what we would normally do, which is by selecting who's going to breed and who's not going to breed. And when we do that, when we select who's going to breed and who's not going to breed, that's based on genetic differences that arise over which we have no control. You know, why does this one individual grow faster than this one? You know, we know we want to breed that fast-growing one, but why is it growing faster? Well, generally that's because of some error in the replication in its chromosomes, generally due to some kind of spontaneous mutation. So something has changed in the genetic makeup of that animal, most likely a mutation. And generally mutations are, in a biological sense, we say they're detrimental. In other words, the animal does poorly when there's a mutation. Occasionally it does better. You know, maybe that becomes the individual that grows faster, but we have no control over that. So we're just waiting for random events to occasionally give us that mutation that gives us a faster growing fish or a disease-resistant fish or whatever. Genetic modification allows you to target exactly that trait. So we know the biology, what controls growth. Wow. So let's modify the genome directly rather than waiting for some random event to give us that.
Fascinating.
Yeah, so it's, to my mind, it's an accelerated breeding plan, an accelerated path towards domestication. It comes with a lot of negative baggage, I think, largely because most people, again, goes back to not understanding where your food comes from, not understanding what's actually being done when we make a genetically modified salmon or some other genetically modified organism.
Well, maybe this is a good spot to pause, actually, and we'll be right back. We have to pause for a couple of minutes for community announcements, and we'll be right back. Thank you. Thanks for returning. Our guest today is Tillman Benfey. Close?
You got it.
All right.
You nailed it.
Professor of biology at the University of New Brunswick. We were wandering into the notion of accelerating the species growth rates, positive characteristics for domesticating a salmon as opposed to just the wild salmon. And you made a great point about how we've been doing this for a long time. We've been doing versions of for cows, pigs. We've lost connection with where our food comes from, which would help this conversation in general for the public about the same things happening around salmon as a particular one for New Brunswick, because that's one of our strengths. But as you were explaining just before break, part of me was starting to feel, you know, some people in the audience be going, we're not supposed to be messing around with this stuff. But science has always done that. Science has always gone in and play. So then that begs, when the audience does that little gut check moment, which is okay, because that's where they are, how do we help them understand the safety element, the trust element, and differentiate it from when they hear the words GMO when applied to 1,000 other areas?
And so the point I always try to make is, so we can get in a little bit about how genetically modified salmon are made. But the point I always try to make is we need to separate the process, so how we genetically modify salmon or other animals or plants for that matter, from the product. What is our actual goal? So in terms of discussing safety issues, health issues, and so on, it's at the end of the day, I think it's the product that we need to be concerned about, not the process itself. So again, the process itself, it's a different approach to changing the genetic makeup of an animal or a plant. But that's always been our goal in farming, is to change the genetic makeup of animals and plants. So that goal has always been the same. We're using a different process. So rather than relying on breeding generation after generation after generation, we identify the characteristic of interest. So in the case of the salmon, for instance, it's fast growth. We figure out what controls that process genetically, what determines whether a fish grows rapidly or not. And then we target our genetic modification to that exact genetic information rather than relying on some random event to give us that. So for instance, back to wild salmon wanting to swim away, and we're we're keeping salmon in cages where they don't have that, they can't fulfill that natural desire to swim away. Well, we know if we keep salmon in cages in the Bay of Fundy in the wintertime, they don't grow well. It's because it's not their natural temperature, so to speak, for a wild salmon. So the genetically modified salmon that we hear about now in the press has specifically been modified to produce growth hormone when temperatures are low, which salmon wouldn't normally do. And there's a reason why wild salmon wouldn't do that, so presumably there's some kind of a trade-off, but we're not talking about wild salmon anymore, right? So now we want to turn this into a farm animal that's going to be different from a wild animal. So the scientists that are behind this genetically modified salmon, their approach was to look at different species of fish that actually do a lot in the wintertime when temperatures are low. So what allows them to thrive under low temperature conditions? And it turns out there's a lot of shallow water marine species in cold environments like the Bay of Fundy, for instance, that produce these really interesting compounds called antifreeze proteins. So they allow, those antifreeze proteins allow them to survive very low temperatures that most fish could not survive. And they produce those antifreeze proteins when temperatures are low in the wintertime, so they protect the animals from freezing. So ocean pout, for instance, is an example of a very common marine fish that we have here. It lives in shallow water in an environment where salmon would literally freeze to death in the wintertime, and they do fine because they produce these proteins that protect them from freezing, antifreeze proteins. So producing those proteins requires turning on genes to produce something. So there are genes that are called promoters. Promoter genes then turn on the production of something like antifreeze proteins. So what the scientists behind this GM salmon did was they took a antifreeze protein promoter from ocean pout, so something that'll turn on production at low temperatures, and they combined it with a growth hormone gene from a different species of salmon, Chinook salmon. So now we have a promoter gene that will turn something on, and rather than turning on antifreeze protein from ocean pout, it turns on growth hormone production from Chinook salmon at low temperature. And they took this bit of DNA and they put it in the Atlantic salmon genome. So now we have Atlantic salmon that produce their own growth hormone at low levels in the summertime, but are now producing Chinook salmon growth hormone in the wintertime when normally they wouldn't be growing. So they grow fast.
How long a process did you just described it in a minute and a half.
Yeah.
How long a process was that in real time?
Yeah, well, and that didn't involve me at all. It's just I know the people that did the work, but I wasn't a part of that. So from the original idea to actually demonstrating having a product that you know will actually demonstrate that trait that you want. It's not something that's being produced for farming, but at least sort of proof of concept. Probably took about 15 years of university-based research before they could scale that up in any way. So what they've done is produced a salmon that grows rapidly throughout the year, which a wild salmon normally would not do. And there are very good reasons why a wild salmon would not do that. Otherwise, it would do it, right?
Yeah,
so from an evolutionary standpoint, it's obviously not beneficial in the long run and on an evolutionary scale for wild salmon to do this, otherwise they would. But again, we're not talking about wild salmon, we're talking about now a farmed animal.
Yeah, and it's not an either or, it's just an adaptation or a shift in a direction through a system, you know, because wild salmon are still there.
Sure.
It's not like it did some damage to wild salmon. And sometimes the narrative comes up as a either or black and white. And it's always a three-dimensional spider.
And in fact, even without this genetic modification, farmed salmon now grow faster than farmed salmon did 20 or 30 years ago through traditional breeding processes. So the end goal, and back to my comment about process versus product, you know, the product really is the same thing. It's a fast-growing salmon, but we produce a fast-growing salmon with a different genetic pathway than the traditional breeding pathway.
This is excellent because it brings some clarity and some depth to where the changes occurred. Because as you were just talking, I was thinking, but somewhere out there, someone's probably thinking, no, it's the feed that they give the cow to create the super cow to create all the milk. Because I got into the human growth hormone stuff in instance of cows, and people will take that common sense knowledge and then apply it to any time they hear something similar.
And I mean, just sort of a sidebar, I mean, the reality is you could feed human growth hormone to salmon and they would grow faster. But the point is no salmon farmer would want to do that because who's going to buy salmon that have been fed human growth hormone?
Which is kind of obvious once you say it, isn't it? So it sends slides to a next piece that's really important to get into is public trust.
Yeah.
It still is this. You've said several times. It's still the same salmon.
Yeah.
Because it's a farm salmon. It's not the same as wild salmon. It's a farm salmon. It's being more domesticated. It's got its own growth rate. Mm-hmm. It's almost got its own design in a way, not unlike pigs or chickens or other things. So then the food safety element. Yeah. You want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah. You know, generally the concerns with genetically modified animals or plants fall into three broad categories, and two of them I think have some scientific validity, and the third less so. So the third one, which I'm not really the right person to address, is just the ethics. So it's not a science question, but is it ethically right? Should we be doing this? Yeah. I mean, you know, we can certainly talk about that, but that's more of a philosophical question than a science-based question. The science-based questions, I think, are: is this product safe to eat? So what's the risk to us? And will this genetically modified salmon have negative impacts on wild salmon or other organisms in nature? So the human health aspect really is evaluated by regulatory agencies that look at any kinds of foods or drugs or whatever, U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Canadian Food Inspection Alliance, and so on. Yeah. And so they look at what is different about this product compared to something that we know is safe. So you need to have some kind of something to compare it to. Yeah. So what do you compare a genetically modified salmon? Well, compare it to a non-genetically modified salmon is the obvious thing to do. And the principal difference between the genetically modified salmon and the non-modified salmon is that genetically modified salmon produces growth hormone from Chinook salmon. Well, we know Chinook salmon is a species that's safe to eat. Yep. You know, we farm Chinook salmon in British Columbia, we eat Chinook salmon. Yep. So from the human health perspective, and it's not just me saying this is scientists that look at food safety say there's nothing about this genetically modified salmon, this product, that makes it inherently more or less harmful to human health than a traditionally farmed salmon. So, you know, I think a lot of people have concerns, we can debate those as well, about farmed salmon in general. Mm-hmm. But this specific issue, that the point is that genetically modified salmon are no better, no worse from a human health perspective. So if you're comfortable eating farmed salmon in general, then you should have no concerns eating those genetically modified salmon. The other issue, which to my mind is a more valid scientific issue, is what happens if these genetically modified fish escape and interbreed with wild salmon, which is a very realistic scenario anywhere where we have wild salmon. Yep. Bay of Fundy, Newfoundland, Norway, Scotland, Chile. Oh, sorry, not Chile. Norway, Scotland. That's the possibility that if you farm these genetically modified salmon in a system where they can escape, that there's a risk that they will interbreed with wild salmon. So that's, I think, a legitimate concern. But again, that's not specific to genetically modified salmon. That's always been an issue of farmed animals escaping and interbreeding with wild salmon.
And the concern is why? Because I just went off in 2 or 3 different directions. Yeah. There's probably instances of this in other cases or in other species. Yeah.
And I think it ties back to a comment I made earlier, which is that wild salmon are, through evolution, designed to have one type of biology, which includes, for instance, we were saying earlier, to migrate off to Greenland or whatever. And domesticated salmon, we're trying to breed a fish that doesn't do that. So they are genetically different. So wild salmon do as well as they do. Any wild organism does as well as it does through natural selection. It's always the most successful individuals that reproduce. Yeah. So evolution gives us the individuals that are most likely to survive and propagate and generate the next generation. Yeah. So that's a very long process to fine-tune things evolutionarily. So now we've got domesticated animals that we are breeding with different goals, so they are genetically different. So if they now escape and interbreed with wild animals, and it's not just salmon that this would apply to, then we are changing the genetic structure of those wild salmon, and they may no longer be as well adapted for surviving in nature. So I mean, we fundamentally want to prevent, where possible, farmed animals from interbreeding with wild animals. And in some cases, like chickens, that's just not an option anymore, because when's the last time you saw wild chicken, you know, in New Brunswick? But it's a very real possibility with salmon, because even though we are domesticating salmon. We're at most 10 generations removed from wild salmon.
Yeah, and plus humans walk on the land. We don't swim in the water, so
right.
we can chase the chickens down, but it's a bit harder to chase the fish down.
Yeah, for sure. So there's sort of two. So how do you address this for genetically modified salmon, or in fact for any salmon in general? Well, the current technology for farming salmon is in cages in the open ocean. So those cages they're well designed to contain fish, but things can go wrong, in a bad storm.
Salmon are good jumpers.
Yeah, and year by year, the escape rate goes down. So what percentage of salmon are escaping from farms? That percentage is getting smaller and smaller and smaller every year, but it's not zero. So there's always a risk that salmon will escape from cages. So you from the standpoint of protecting wild salmon, you have two options. One option is to take salmon out of cages in the ocean and put them in a secure facility on land. And you can do that. You can build a warehouse with a concrete floor and 4 walls and a roof.
Yeah.
And you can build tanks, put tanks in that, and you can run water in and recirculate that water, and then run water out through screens and all that. So it is possible to build facilities from which salmon will not escape. But to do that has very high energy costs and very high infrastructure costs.
Yep.
So it's not an economically viable way of farming salmon, at least not right now.
And in some ways it will still be an artificial environment, or at least in the bay, they're getting all the other elements of the bay, if not the ability to swim.
Right, for good or bad. So for instance, it's a way of eliminating sea lice as a problem if you have this kind of an onshore facility, but you create other problems. At least you have the potential for creating other problems. The other approach, so one approach is to put them inland, put them on land in sort of a warehouse kind of structure. The other option is to come up with ways to ensure that if those salmon do escape, that they can't reproduce. Okay. And that's actually one of the main areas of research in my lab, is to come up with ways of effectively producing salmon or other species of fish that are reproductively sterile. So they meet all the needs of a farmer's requirements in terms of growth and disease resistance and all that, but they can't reproduce. So if they should escape, that individual fish maybe survives in the wild, but it will not pass its genes on. It will not interbreed with wild salmon and pass its genes on to wild fish.
Wow. It's almost mind-boggling to even try to conceive of that, no pun intended. Wow. So tied back to the food system then, so people should have a high degree of confidence that their farm salmon is a good food product. Yeah.
And so farm salmon, absolutely. I think any food product. Yeah. And I guess part of the problem with that is how do we know, right? I don't have the resources to check the quality of that salmon fillet I buy, or that slab of butter or whatever. So that's where we have to rely on regulatory agencies. For instance, in Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that does that for us.
In the integrity of the system. When traveling through some airports, sometimes you'll see ads on the walls with barcodes on different food products, with the notion of one day you'll be able to scan the barcode on the food product with your cell phone, so you'll know the origins of your food.
Yeah. You can do that already, for instance, with some oysters that you buy in Atlantic Canada. Okay. You can follow it back and see who was the farmer that produced that oyster that you're now.
I always thought that's somewhat ironic, because once upon a time when your food supply came from local sources, you knew the farmer down the road. You knew the person who had the hens with the eggs. So now with the global food supply, or the amazing carbon footprint of some food as it moves all over the world, rather than just being grown locally.
Yeah. And that's really one of the beauties of New Brunswick, is we have the ability to not just farm animals and plants on land, but to farm aquatic foods.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that gets into one of the other themes that keeps coming up during these interviews with the many different guests. Is that, why are we buying carrots from California when we can grow our own? Yeah. So where we're tucked geographically and with our population base, I keep waiting for the conversation to break on our narrative on the economy, that we should be going back to a food source economy, because we've got all of the pieces. We've got the right climate, we've got the right location, we've got the water and the land.
Yeah. But unfortunately, a lot of it goes back to, and we're doing that to some extent in New Brunswick, and everywhere, this idea of a sort of 100-mile diet or something like that, where you only buy things that are produce within 100 miles or 100 kilometers of where you live. So some people are doing that already, but it goes back to so many people not knowing where their food comes from.
Yes.
And always wanting the same thing. So I want baby carrots 12 months of the year, not just when they're being produced locally.
Yeah.
Or potatoes. I want potatoes. Well, maybe not a good example because they store well, but strawberries. Great example of strawberries.
Fruits, yeah.
So we have fantastic strawberries produced in New Brunswick for a very short period of time.
Yep.
So for most of the year, if you want strawberries, they have to come from California or somewhere else.
Yep.
And the big suppliers of that product, the grocery store chains, for instance, they don't want to have to be sourcing strawberries from different places. So they just want to know, I can go to this company and they will give me the same product. It doesn't matter the quality necessarily. They just want to know that 12 months of the year, I can give my consumers what they're looking for, which is the exact same thing 12 months of the year. So we have the opportunities. Living in Fredericton, you can go to the market on Saturday morning and you can buy local foods, but a lot of people prefer the convenience of going to a grocery store.
And I was thinking just a bit bigger, because what I've learned from different guests. So one guest said, why don't we do the greenhouses like they do in Quebec? Some 10,000 acres worth of greenhouses. And it wasn't just, I wasn't quite thinking just a local market, because we're not a big enough population. But if every other business wants to locate because of proximity to New England states, then why aren't we doing it in all the different sectors? Why is it just the IT sector that wants to do it, or the oil industry sector? And
aquaculture, a very good example, because no matter how good a job the Norwegians or the Scots or even salmon farmers in Newfoundland do, none of them are as close to Boston as we are.
Yeah, and great irony, people think of Maine lobster, of which a certain percentage, a great percentage, actually comes from the Bay of Fundy from New Brunswick, but they repackage it, call it Maine lobster, and everyone in New England knows about Maine lobster, but they don't know about New Brunswick lobster. So we have some branding stuff to work on there. But it's an example of a pathway or a direction or where New Brunswick could have a breakthrough on its food supply, including the aquaculture element, that it's that close. You didn't need a barcode on it because you knew just over here. But back to the issue of trust, because it was something I wanted to use the show to reinforce. So people should be trusting it because diets are changing. It's fascinating how people will be interested on knowing the food source and omega-3 oils and salmon and all that, but they're still buying all kinds of soda pops and high acid foods. And so there's a growing demand probably as populations become more aware of eating better for that very thing. So wouldn't it be nice if they had a confidence that this is really good for you, so trust it.
Yeah, and the information is certainly there, that the benefits of eating fish, for instance, compared to eating red meat, in terms of, exactly like you say, omega fatty acids and so on, a real health benefit for eating seafood.
Yeah. Is carbon footprint, you'll get that a lot about eating red meat. They'll talk about this much CO2 went into production of that steak as opposed to if you ate veggies. Yeah,
the carbon footprint, you sort of have to do, you have to look at what's commonly called life cycle assessment. So all the inputs and all the outputs. So the carbon footprint while salmon are in cages is actually very, very small.
Yeah.
The biggest issues there are probably surrounding the sources of the feed that's going into those fish now, especially again if it's fish meal and fish oil that's going into those. So we're talking about marine fisheries, so boats that are going out on the ocean, burning diesel fuel and so on, very far away from here. A lot of it is coming from the Pacific coast of South America. To capture fish that are then rendered into oil and processed into fish meal. So there's a fairly significant carbon footprint to that. And that's another benefit of transitioning from those fish meal, fish oil-based diets for salmon to plant meal, plant oil-based diets.
Where would you like to go next? Because we've touched on a little bit on the ethics, a little bit on the university, a little bit on New Brunswick's advantage. Do you, can we do a vision thing? Like, where do we need to go next so that New Brunswick takes care of itself and in terms of economy, creating jobs, security of food supply? Sounds like you sit at an interesting intersection of where all those things happen, but it might take 15 years for it to show up.
Yeah, well, there's some real advantages that we have in New Brunswick on a small scale, in Canada on a larger scale. Historically, one is our aquatic resources, our marine resources. So we have a long history of producing and consuming foods and other resources from the oceans, traditionally by harvesting them from the wild. So I think we're in a great position with a relatively affluent population, relatively educated population, to be world leaders in making this transition from harvesting wild aquatic resources to farming them. And we have been leaders in salmon, for instance, so to carry that on to other examples.
One of the major themes, divergent but connected, is the value-added element, meaning we do the processing here as well.
Yeah.
Does that happen in the salmon world?
It does, absolutely, yeah. And that's a great way to make value out of products that normally would not have even been kept. So at one time when you had a farmed salmon, you would take the fillets off and the rest was discarded. So now a lot of those little bits are turned into portions that maybe are marinated and sold as salmon bites, something like that. The skin can be used as leather. There's a lot of other applications from that whole product, so that nothing is wasted. And we're doing a lot of that in New Brunswick.
Really?
Yeah. Great.
Don't hear those stories very much. We have about a minute left. How would you like to wrap this up?
Well, I hope I can leave people with a positive image of the benefits of salmon farming, specifically in aquaculture in general. The importance of us all understanding where our food comes from and promoting safe and sustainable production of foods for our local consumption, but also make a contribution to a global scale.
Great. Thank you for this. You've
taught
us well.
Yeah, thanks very much.
And thank you for watching. The Dennis Report can be also found on my website, dennisatchison.com. We're an open-ended or publicly funded organization or show. So if you see the Patreon icon on the website, please think about clicking it and making a small pledge, much like PBS does in the States, so we can continue to do this. And we'll be posted on YouTube at some point as well. As always, thanks for watching. Be good, have fun, and love each other.